Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. Welcome to
Check 1, 2, 3. Check, check.
Okay, do that again.
Check 1, 2, 3. Check, check.
Yep.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a live podcast of Hellbent for Horror, coming at you from Sun Studios in Arizona. And we are here at Phoenix FearCON, sharing our love of the most beautiful genre of them all, horror. And in Hellbent for Horror, my wonderful saying is that I am here to remind all those normal people that they used to love horror movies and they secretly still do. But everybody that's in this room knows the secret, that this is the greatest of all genres. It is perfectly made for allegory and for metaphor and for parable. It takes all of our pain and turns it into art, and that's what I love about the horror film. Now, Phoenix FearCON is a community-driven horror event that started as a film festival, but it has grown into an interactive event. It's a celebration of independent filmmakers and artists and their fans. And FearCON showcases the creative process, the creative spirit itself, which includes the obstacles that independent artists face. The goal is to uncover new talent and to have the horror community grow together. And of course, have a ton of fun talking about it as well. What we all have in common here is passion. And what we're going to talk about today is going to be about the passion that we have for horror and some of the roots that come from that. And today I have Dr. Rhitt Bruart here. He's from Paradise Valley Community College, and he is a big aficionado for the early days of horror when we're talking about things like horror hosts and radio. So we're going to talk about the genus that comes from that. Because what I love about horror hosts is that it's kind of like the ferryman over the river Styx, right? We have this storyteller that needs to get us from one side to the other. And we had this guy who was a safety net for us, kept us protected while we were watching the ghoulies and the ghosties and the goblins and the beasties when we were kids. And I love how what happens is a phenomenon that happens in America that is unique to America. There are very few that you'll find in Europe that are horror hosts. And it all happens at the same time, and it's kind of this wave that goes across America when popularity happens for the horror film, where it resurges from where it's kind of kiddie stuff to actually being something that's shown late at night, and kids and adults are watching it for various reasons. So, Britt, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. It's interesting that you mentioned that it's uniquely American, and it is because, you know, this is where horror hosts still rule the roost and kind of where horror movies still do. But I did a little bit of research, and one of the very first modern horror hosts was this guy named Oscar Mettenier, who was the host of the theater of the Grand Guignol.
Oh, yes.
The very famous horror theater coming out of Paris in the late 1890s through the early 1960s.
1963, I think.
Yeah, 1963 was the last performance. And for those of you who don't know what the Grand Guignol is, basically it was a gore movie theater, or not movie theater, but actual theater that you could go to and see heavily gory plays that I don't know how they got away with all the stuff that they got away with it without being arrested. But Mettenier used to stand out front of the theater in a black cloak surrounded by bodyguards and would describe to people the horrors they would see inside the theater, which also owes its a little bit to classic Greek theater.
Yes.
But when it comes to modern American horror hosts, it really does start with radio. And the first one I can really name is Old Nancy, who was on The Witch's Tale. It's my 111th birthday, and she's talking to Satan, her wise black cat, and just telling him these stories. And it's cool that you mentioned that. There's the safety aspect to watching horror with a horror host. Who's leading us in and out of the world of horror. Because with the radio horror host, you didn't always have that safety.
Right.
With Old Nancy, you had the idea that she could go crazy at any time. We were talking about Midwest horror before we started talking, and out of Detroit, you had The Hermit's Cave, one of the great horror radio plays ever. And you would go up to the Hermit's Cave every weeknight and everything, and you would hear ghost stories, weird stories, and murders too. The Hermit knows them all. And so while you were there with the Hermit, there wasn't the feeling of safety within the world of that, because you had to inhabit the hermit's world with somebody like Mr. Raymond on Inner Sanctum Mysteries.
Right.
On the other hand, you had a little more humor, where they, good evening, friends. As your host to welcome you through the creaking door. They say we make murder our business, but we wouldn't do that. I'll be mixing business with pleasure. And so he would add a bit of levity, and so when it came time to transition to television, that levity was more or less kept. Shock Theater, one of the first
Absolutely.
big packages of Universal movies to be distributed to TV stations
Yeah.
across the country. You would just have whoever your local person was.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it was just somebody who worked for...
The weatherman.
Yeah, the weatherman, or, the TV host. One of the great parodies of this is on SCTV.
Yes, Count Floyd.
Yeah, Count Floyd, who would have his horror host. But if you watch SCTV enough, you would realize that Floyd was also just one of the regular news guys.
Yeah.
Lovingly played by Joe Flaherty.
Floyd Camembert.
Yeah, Floyd Camembert. That was his name. You would just have all these guys and gals across the country. Vampira being one of the
Early ones.
Yeah, original horror hosts, and so influential. Zachary, the Cool Ghoul, being another really fun one.
So I think it's really interesting that you talked about the shock package. And one of the things that I've talked about on my podcast is how we have these very strange things that become part of our collective. And they happen out of a hole somewhere in the system. So if you're looking at comic books, when the first comic books happen, it's because newspapers are losing their subscriptions. The only thing that's making any money are the comic strips. So they take the old comic strips and they put them in a book. So the first comic books have nothing to do with superheroes, they're just replays of the old comics. And once they found that that was going to make money, they ended up having that. Punk rock, same thing. And here we have studios are losing money hand over fist. Movies aren't making any money anymore because the monopoly of the movie theaters that each studio had was broken.
Which is what we had in 1948 with the Paramount Decree.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court just basically struck that down quietly
Yes.
last September, which is pretty horrible when you think about it.
Oh, yeah. Especially for independent people.
Yeah. In the 1940s, one of the reasons we broke it up is you had the big five major studios, the little three, and then there weren't a whole lot of independent studios beyond that, other than some of the independent, like Black Theaters.
Yeah. Or the 40 Thieves, the guys that used to stay on.
40 Thieves, absolutely. Yeah. Kroger Bad.
Yeah.
Where
These guys used to have tents
you gotta
at the end.
tell them to sell them.
Yeah. You'd have tents at the end of town that they would show these movies until the sheriff showed up.
Oh, and you could get away with so much. And literally going to those old 40 Thieves shows were basically just going so you could see something weird and taboo.
Transgression.
Yeah. One of the, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, one of the top 10 grossing films of the 1940s actually is one of those 40 Thieves ones, and it's Mom and Dad.
Yes.
Which is literally a birth of a baby film.
Mm-hmm.
That's the entire point of the movie, is there's not much of a story. Woman gets pregnant, couple gets married, and then at the end of the film they show an actual birth of a baby.
They used to call them white lab coat movies. They would start the movie with an actor who looked like a doctor. You'd sit at a table and tell you exactly what you were going to see and be ready for it. And they tried to make it an instructional, educational video. Strangely enough, mostly it was women who went to these movies because women weren't given any sex education whatsoever. And they were getting this from like Kroger Bab and guys like that in these tents.
And they would always be like, Dr. Kroger Bab, but they would be running in multiple cities, so it was always Dr. Whoever in whatever city. And on top of that, beyond just selling the movie and selling, they had these books that they would sell to people for like $3 a pop. That would just be like a little sex ed book.
Yeah.
It was utterly brilliant marketing.
Oh, yeah. There were so many ways we got around censorship, whatever that censorship might be. There was the idea that after the Hayes Act, you would have movies that you could do anything that you wanted for the first 3 reels. Why there were so many Sandal and Sand movies, or biblical movies, was that for the first 2 reels or 3 reels, you could show all sorts of debauch and violence and cruelty and sex as long as the last reel was redemption. So Scarface, movies like that, the early ones, you could show anything as long as they were punished for it afterwards. And that's one of the ways that we got around that censorship. I think what's interesting, I want to go back to what we were talking about with the shock theater package. The idea of why I brought up comic books and stuff is that there was an emptiness that was happening because the movie theaters were losing money because they no longer had this monopoly. People weren't going to the movies because of television. Television and the movies hated each other. And then you had something, ABC, NBC, and CBS started affiliate stations. And that is where the birth of the horror host really comes from. So when you had independent stations, which most of us grew up with the independent stations, unless you were in LA or Chicago or New York City, you were an affiliate, which means that you had 3 or 4 hours of prime time that came from ABC itself in New York or Los Angeles. And the rest of it, you had to fill yourself. Exactly. So all of a sudden there was dead air. And it was after hours. So what happens after 10 o'clock when that's the end of what New York is going to give you? So the barnstormers that were out there, the people who were not making money at Universal, they sat there and said, we've got this stuff that's just sitting in a vault. 31 really not very great horror movies. Why don't we sell those? And I think the genius, and we don't know who the genius is who wrote that booklet, but there's a booklet that came with a shock package. And that was sent to all the affiliates who were hungry to have anything that they could put on TV. So the movie theater is scratching the back of the independent, and the independent is now getting something from the Universal Theater. But in that packet, they would say things like, have friends over in the studio while we're watching the movie, have caskets on the stage. And they literally said, why don't you take your weatherman and put him in a cape? And everybody came up with the same idea across the country at the same time because this thing came out. Nobody knew it was going to be a phenomenon, but it became this huge thing that changed the culture.
Well, it's interesting because I've looked at a lot of press books from around that era because I wrote my dissertation around 50s and 60s, often independent exploitation cinema, and so many of those movies not only had the strategy for what to do when you're advertising on television, but what to do when you're advertising it for a theater. And one of my favorite ones was for I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and it said you should get a bunch of guys in werewolf masks and have them picket outside the theater saying unfair to werewolves, not werewolves, werewolves.
Yes, they did that. I think it was, for the Mummy. That they went to, I think it was the Los Angeles Museum of History, and they had people dressed as mummies inside of the ancient history area. So they were just trying to have as much publicity as they could, as cheaply as possible. So they just had actors go in there and do that.
Absolutely, and it was a co-thing between the independent studios at the time and the TV stations and the various movie theaters at which they were showing these shows. In fact, the one thing that really kept film alive in the 1950s was the drive-in.
Yes.
And the emerging boomer teenage market.
The first teenage market.
Because they didn't have the name for teenagers
right.
before that. It was a brand new concept, which is why you have teenage movies before that, like the Dead End Kids.
Yep.
And the last Dead End Kids movie, the guys are in their late 30s still playing teenagers.
Yeah. Oh, it's crazy. If you look at the birth, or not the birth, drive-ins were around since the 30s, but when they really hit that boom in the 50s, it's because most of the tickets that are being sold are sold to teenagers. Teenagers want to get out of the house. They want to get in a car. They want to have some privacy. And the adults are staying home and going for television if they want to go for anything. So all of a sudden there's a teen market, which is why you have monster movies and biker movies and stuff like that that are in the theater or in the drive-ins. So the delinquent movies are really big. those movies, and I always like to look at like the beach blanket movies, the things with Annette and Frankie Avalon.
Yeah,
They're
Beach Party.
these surreal movies that no teenager really wants to see.
No, they were
They're
not cool at all.
Yeah, they're the weirdest thing because the first people who are representing teenagers in films are middle-aged guys writing movies trying to figure out what teenagers want. So we're getting an idea in the pop culture of what a teenager is from people who are not teenagers.
What is it? In the first Beach Party movie, one of the primary characters is a beatnik character played by classic vaudevillian
Yep.
actor Maury Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Because that's who you want to appeal to teenage audiences.
Yeah.
Maury Amsterdam.
And Buster Keaton.
And Buster Keaton also appearing in that movie. Thank God it has that a cameo from Vincent Price at the end.
Right.
That's the only reason to see Beach Party is just for that little bit of Vincent Price you get at the end.
Yeah. So there's all this history that comes into how pop culture is slowly building into something big. And I think it's really important to kind of couch where horror movies were at this time. So I don't know if it's well known, but I'll bring up the story that Roger Ebert saw Night of the Living Dead in 1968 at a children's show, a Saturday morning matinee, because horror movies at that time were relegated to the Saturday morning matinee for kids. And so nobody knew what they were getting with Night of the Living Dead. And kids are running out traumatized because they're seeing flesh eating happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing when, there's a great story that Patton Oswalt, one of my favorite stand-ups, tells, where he talks about, big moments that made his life and made him who he is. He calls them night cafe moments. And it's basically rooms you enter and you leave forever changed. And his first night cafe that he talks about is going to see at a local public library Nosferatu. And so they just thought, oh, it's this spooky old vampire movie. Nobody had seen it on 16 millimeter. And that movie, it celebrates its centennial next year. And it still holds up as a supremely frightening movie and really creepy. Just some of the shots that Murnau got in that movie.
Oh, yes. That and Robert Wine's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is 100 years old. And these are two, German Expressionism is one of the things that I say gives us the thumbprint of where horror goes. But when we're talking about horror hosts, it's a gentler world that we have when we're talking about these guys late at night. So you want to talk a little bit about the genus, the history, some of the early folks?
So yeah, some of the early folks are like, I've mentioned Vampira, who, really served.
Out of L.A.
Yeah, out of L.A. On the West Coast, who really served as kind of the inspiration later for Elvira. Although Elvira really took it and made the character very much her own. Even though Vampire later sued Elvira for stealing the gimmick. But then again, you could argue that every horror host kind of stole everybody. How many ghouls were there?
Oh my goodness!
There was Ghoulardi, there was Zachary the Cool Ghoul, there was the Ghoul, there was Son of Ghoul. And so many vampires, and Morgus the Magnificent, who was a mad scientist out of New Orleans. And so you had all of these guys who were, again, just working for the TV station, figuring, hey, I can get an extra couple $100 out of my paycheck this week if I just go in and make fun of a horror movie that we're all watching together for the next, hour and a half. Mm-hmm. And that was the great thing. Ghoulardi, who's really one of the groundbreakers in this, would actively not only make fun of the movies, but make fun of the viewers of the movie for sitting there and watching. Look, this is a really bad movie we got this week, and you're here on a Saturday night, watching this. What are you doing with your life? Watching this channel and watching this movie, and it was brilliant. Like nobody was making fun of their own TV stations before, but people like Ghoulardi and Zachary,
Bob Wilkins.
Bob Wilkins is another guy who is utterly unique because everybody else was this character. And
he's smoking a cigar on a rocking chair.
Yeah, all he's doing is he's a regular guy, just glasses, cigar, and then talking to you like he's a horror movie expert, which he in fact was. But he's not putting on a character. He's just there because he likes horror movies. You like horror movies. Let's watch some some horror movies
Yeah.
together.
He would sit there and say things like, the movie that you're going to watch today, we found it in a bag behind the dumpster. And as soon as we're done with this movie, it's going back in a bag behind the dumpster.
Exactly.
And we loved him for it. And that's the thing that I think is fun with him.
So many of those classic horror hosts were just the ways they would play with the movies and play with the audience. It was utterly engrossing and a really fun way to kill a Saturday night if you didn't have a date and weren't going to be going out. It was a friendly face to see who would always deliver a little bit of humor and comedy.
Yeah. Well, the
and-
Ghoul was someone that the college students actually watched.
Yeah, everybody loved. You can't see this over the podcast. I'm wearing the Ghoul pin right now, and yeah, he was an utterly fantastic character. He was the guy who was the successor to Ghoulardi. Really took over the Detroit market, but also led into Cleveland and everything. And that's another thing. I mean, the fact is, so many of those horror hosts came from the Midwest and came from Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Those were kind of the three big places to have these horror hosts. Just because horror hosts are very self-deprecating, and that's kind of the humor of those eras, particularly Cleveland.
Yeah.
We were talking before the thing about Cinema Wasteland, which is
Yes.
one of our similar favorite horror conventions that we go to, and I swear to God, every time I go to there's at least 5 horror hosts who just show up.
Yes.
The Monkey and the Mummy.
Yep.
Son of Ghoul.
Mhm. Those two are always there.
Yeah. What was it? Gunga Jim? I
Yep,
think is the
Gunga
guy.
Jim, yep.
Who's the guy who does his big thing on Saturday? A Ghastly Ghoul.
Yeah, a Ghastly Ghoul as well.
Who will actually do a horror host thing on Saturday nights if you go to Cinema Wasteland and puts on a whole horror host show, just like the old days. We'll get the audience to interact. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Is Cinema Wasteland if people ever get the chance to go to that.
Yeah, Cinema Wasteland's fantastic. I've done a podcast about that where I went there and was indoctrinated about 5 years ago. And it is hardcore horror and exploitation movie junkies. And everybody that's there as a guest is someone who was in those movies from the 70s and the 80s.
And oftentimes they'll do things that are just like based around a certain film. Like I remember a couple years ago they had the cast of My Bloody Valentine out.
Street Trash.
Street Trash, yeah, that was another one that they had. My favorite one, though, was when they had Michael Berryman come out a couple years ago.
Yes.
I can't remember. Just because he is the nicest human being. Like, we have this image of him as this classic monster, this modern monster. But I was literally just walking past his table. He didn't have much of a line because it was Sunday, was the last day and everything. And so I just really quickly went up and said, hey, by the way, I really enjoyed your films. Hey, you want to get a picture together? He didn't charge me anything. He was just super, real chill about it. And that's the thing I like about these horror movie conventions is you get to just hang out with the cast. You get to hang out with other horror fans and talk about these things. Because I'll tell you, I go to a lot of academic conferences. And while there is a horror contingent at those conferences, if you are talking about horror movies oftentimes in just a film panel, often people will put their noses up and be like, oh, yes, no. Although that leads to one of my favorite controversies in academia that's going on right now, which is the idea of elevated horror.
Oh, God. You can get me going.
A term I utterly hate.
Yep.
I like the movies that they put in elevated horror, The Babadook, Midsummer, Get Out. All these films are great films, but they treat them like, oh, they're not horror films.
Right.
They're art films that are discussing mental illness or race relations. Like
all horror
movies
films do.
Yeah, like horror movies haven't been doing that for well over 100 years at this point.
I have an entire one-man show called My Horror Manifesto, which is about how horror does not deserve your shame. And I talk a lot about elevated horror and post-horror. The post-horror drives me crazy because it just tells you what it's not. It gives you no idea what it is. It's certainly not horror. That's the only thing that we know. And I hate it because the movies that they use, that they single out, that are dread infused. They are proud descendants of the horror film that has been doing this decade after decade. You can go all the way back to Robert Wise's The Haunting. You can go earlier than that. There have always been dread-infused films that have always striven for art. And to say that these are just anomalies is so counterproductive, especially because it's counterproductive, right? If you sit there and you say that a horror movie, that this movie isn't a horror movie because it does this, if you change the genre every time a horror movie is exceptional, then there are no exceptional horror movies. You are making it forced to be something that people will think is dumb.
And then people will point to some of these movies and be like, oh, they're not really horror movies.
Right.
Which is the other thing. Like, people point to Silence of the Lambs as, oh, it's not a horror movie. It won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. How could it possibly be a horror movie? It's a movie about a guy who skins people into a
Two active serial killers.
Yeah, and another dude who eats people on a fairly regular basis on screen in the movie. I mean, that is utterly a horror film.
Yeah, level of dread is high.
Yeah, I mean, the Shape of Water. Somebody was talking about this earlier today. You know, it is just Creature from the Black Lagoon where the creature gets the girl.
Yeah. I always laugh about that. People go, well, it's a monster movie, not a horror movie. And I said, that's like saying that you're a proud citizen of Kansas, but not the United States.
Exactly. You know, yeah, it's one of those things that really bugs me. And I got to introduce, what was it, Hereditary at a film festival a couple years ago. And, you know, I could tell that there were people in the audience who were of that ilk who were just like, oh, we're watching it because it's more than a horror movie.
Yeah.
And I spoke to them and I'm just like, it's not. It is a horror movie.
Yeah.
It does have allegories, but then again, most horror movies do. And
Right.
most really good horror movies.
Even bad horror movies. What I tell people is, if you want to know what really freaked people out in any decade, look at the B movies.
Yes.
Because those movies needed to find the sore spot that they could exploit. It's in the name. They needed to know what freaked people out on both sides so that you would go to see it.
So my dissertation was on depictions of the hippie counterculture on film between 1965 and 1970. And one of the things that I found regularly within my research is while most of the major studios had like either a positive or at least neutral version of the hippies, like, oh, you know, they're fighting for progressive causes, but we don't support this dope smoking thing.
Right.
Those were like very left-leaning mainstream directors. But all the films that were really exploitative and be like, oh, you know, if you do one hit of acid, you're going to go insane, or hey,
Right.
acid is a date rape drug, you know, which is the entire point of Ride on Sunset Strip.
Yes.
You know, those are all the exploitation films, and all the exploitation films really just engender this kind of immoral panic towards the hippies. Maybe not all of them. You could argue like Psych Out and a couple of these other ones.
Robert Rush film.
Yeah, the or either of the two Roger Corman movies.
Yes.
That were hippie films. The Trip or Gas. You can look at as being very positive because Corman himself was a very progressive director. He
Yeah.
liked to make a buck, but he also liked to make a statement when he could. The best quote I've ever read about Roger Corman was from Sam Arkoff, who said, Roger Corman could have been a great director if he had patience. And you can see that in The Trip, and you can see that in Gas. Where it's like, this is almost really good, but not quite. And the only times he gets to that really good point, I think, are with his Poe movies.
Yeah. So we were talking about a whole bunch of different passions. We talked a bit about the horror host in culture. We also talked about Cinema Wasteland. What I think is interesting or intriguing about Cinema Wasteland is that you have modern, second-generation horror hosts, which blows my mind because the reason horror hosts existed was because there was this hole. It filled something that was necessary, and that hole's gone. The infomercial is taken over. Streaming is taken over. They're like people without a country. Why do you think they're so passionate to want to do that?
Well, you have really, I would say, 3 generations of TV horror hosts. You have the original, like shock theater troupe, say from the 1950s through the late 1970s. The people who would just get, whatever B movie they could to show on any show, and then, make a quick little buck out of it. Then in the 80s, and really late 70s too, but in the 80s you had the birth of people like your Elvira and your Joe Bob Briggs,
Right.
who had an appreciation for these films. Not only had an appreciation, but had really in-depth knowledge.
They were smart.
They were smart. They were characters who were almost larger than the movies they showed, and people really engaged with that. And so the people who are doing it nowadays, people like I just interviewed somebody because I was doing a horror host panel right before this. I interviewed a guy named Stan the Mechanic, who's the Satanic Mechanic from the Rocky Horror Show. He's that guy. And he's doing it now online, and they're just doing it really for the love of the game.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Mummy and the Monkey, another great pair that I really love. Who really just they go on Facebook, do a Facebook live stream every week. Shows some spooky old either public domain, or if they can talk to somebody like Something Weird Video and get the rights to show something, they'll show it, and then they'll do that regular interspersed thing of making fun of the movie and engaging with their audience. And I think that's really cool that people can do that online now, because you can not only have even more access to a broader audience, but you can engage with your audience because you can see that live commenting thing that's going on while everything's going on.
It's very interesting that you bring that up, because it reminds me of Count Gore Duvall, a guy who has been doing this since the 70s, and he survived.
Out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
right?
out of Washington, D.C. He survived every Holocaust that there was to what happens to TV. So he made it through the first time with the infomercials, and he ended up going to cable. And then after cable, he went to, I think, public access. And then when all of that disappeared, he found himself, he's doing it in his basement now.
Yeah.
He has his studio in his basement, and he's doing it live through streaming on YouTube. So there's a true survivor, and he does it for the love of it. And it's amazing that they do that and still have that passion.
And very few people make a living doing this.
Oh, yeah.
I would say maybe Joe Bob Briggs does. I know definitely Joe Bob Briggs does.
Yeah.
Elvira still will revive the character every once in a while. Sandra Peterson, I should say.
Yeah.
Revives the Elvira character every once and again. But beyond that, it's mostly people, again, just doing it because they love horror movies, they love engaging with other horror fans. And that's the thing about horror, is we have fans. Other than maybe not definitely sci-fi, other than sci-fi, there aren't many genres of films where you can have conventions. Like, where's Rom-Com Con?
Right. Yeah.
It just doesn't really happen outside of the sitcom world. But you have horror movie conventions, and you have those diehards that go to it and love it. And then I always talk to people, because I don't just like horror movies. I like all kinds of movies. And so I'll be talking with somebody about film, and then I'll drop some casual horror reference, and then you get that snooty.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Horror movies, of course.
Yeah. How often I hear the same thing, which is when people, all they'll talk about is The Shining. Oh, I love The Shining because it's Stanley Kubrick approved, right? As long as you have that. And I do truly believe that they have no problems. These folks have no problems with the concepts of horror, the horror tropes even. They have a problem with other horror movies and horror fans. For some reason, it's the guilt by association. There's something that they find distasteful in what we love. And I always find that sad, because the thing is that they need it as much as we do. I think that why has horror survived as long as it has? It's the second oldest story ever told. I think it's not because it's a social need. I don't think it's a cultural need. I think it's a human need.
I would agree.
We need that.
Yeah. There's just something that's so delightful about having the living daylight scared out of you. Or, when you can mix, horror and humor.
Yeah.
When you have all these types of different things coming together. And that's the thing, they got a movie booth here. And I was going through stuff, and I'll be like, well, I like these types of horror movies, but then there are these horror movies that I don't like, but I can recognize that other people really like the super gory stuff, the August Underground stuff.
Right.
I'm not a huge fan of those, but I can appreciate that there are people out there who really love those and love them for non-problematic reasons. And when you love something for a very non-problematic cool,
Yeah.
even if I'm not that same outlook.
Of course.
And that's one of the cool things about horror fans and sci-fi fans is we're very accepting of other people. People often joke about like the Star Wars, Star Trek,
Right.
rivalry, and yeah, there's a little bit of ribbing, but nobody's going to war really over
Right.
over
Right.
that rivalry.
And for horror, I mean, it's so subjective, it needs to be open. What
Absolutely.
scares you may not scare me. What scares me might put someone out there in a coma. And I think that it's important that all of that be embraced. Something that you mentioned about the August Underground films. I talk very esoterically at times about horror, but I can also enjoy a bucket of blood here and there, no problem. I don't want to ever give people the idea that I'm apologizing for those horror movies, because they don't deserve that. And my thing is, if I don't like it, it's still subjective. For someone, that movie matters. And to me, it's like, I don't apologize for it, because horror's not supposed to be sharing half a sandwich with you at lunchtime. That's not the point of horror. There are other things that you can go to for that. Horror has a purpose. It has a purpose to get to that shadow self, allow you to accept that, take away some of that anxiety, see where we are all equal in certain ways, find our community. All of these things are reasons for the horror film to be what it is. It is Joseph Campbell's dark woods that the hero has to go into. The woods don't come to you. You come to the woods. And so to me, it's like, yeah, it doesn't have to apologize for anything. That's its purpose. And so I love that you brought that up, because sometimes people are like, oh, well, they're just talking about these certain things. It's like, no. The very thing that I think is so important is that we can respectfully give room for all forms of horror, from the psychological horror to the grotesque to the comedic horror.
Yeah. Another example, I'm not a huge fan of the movie Cannibal Holocaust. I appreciate it for what it is, which is some really interesting commentary. For me, I can't get past the animal mutilations.
Right.
One of the things I love, though, on the DVD is they have the bonus feature where you can get through the animal,
Yeah.
and it doesn't remove anything from the film.
Right.
But I'll mention this movie to people, and first of all, they're just turned off by the time. Oh, Cannibal Holocaust! No way this movie can be anything but what it is. And it's so much more.
Yeah. It's a really good film.
There are those really gory films that just accept it and embrace that. Pieces is a perfect example of it, which has the tagline "Pieces." It's exactly what you think it is.
Yes.
And actually, Pieces has it has two great taglines. It's exactly what you think it is. And Pieces, you don't have to go to Texas for a chainsaw.
Yep,
massacre.
that's the one that I remember.
It's great. It knows what it is. It's accepting of what it is. It will have its fans, and it doesn't have to be anything more than that. And that's the great thing about horror is, no matter what type of horror movie, there will always be somebody drawn to it. And again, I make this argument: as long as you're into it for non-problematic reasons, great. If you watch Schindler's List, on the other hand, and are identifying with the Nazis, that's the problem.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
when it gets into the problematic side of liking certain types of movies.
Yeah.
I just saw Taxi Driver in 35 millimeter.
Oh, wow.
Up on the big screen. And there was this guy 2 seats over from me who had clearly never seen the movie before and was sitting there with his buddy. And all I could hear from him throughout the entire film is, oh, this Travis Bickle, he's so me. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
Taxi Driver is a great movie and you should enjoy it, but you shouldn't identify with Travis Bickle.
Yep.
And if you do, there's something that you need to identify with in yourself and realize that's a problem.
Yep. Same thing with Joker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had the guy who has the Joker mobile outside. And I was kind of like, I love the Joker as a character. I don't want to ever meet him or be like him or be considered, yeah.
So I know we're starting to wind down here. So I did want to talk very quickly to anybody in the audience. One of the things that I wanted to say was what my horror host was, my true confession. I'm from the Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area outside of Philadelphia, and our horror host was Uncle Ted, Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. It was a guy with a big mustache and a fez, and he was a terrible magician. And so they would have him doing bad magic tricks at every one of the breaks. And he was so bad that they would have a close-up insert shot of a rubber rat every time he was about to do his thing. Oh, he was so horrible, and yet I loved him.
Was it Zachary who had
The blobby thing?
The pet amoeba that was
Yep.
just a blob of like Jello, and occasionally that blob would burst
Yep.
from the heat of the lights.
Yep, and people would be like,
And they just
oh.
roll with it. No, that was absolutely brilliant. For me, I actually had the gap because I did, I was, born in a later time, and I didn't really get to grow up with your Zacherleys or your Goulardis, and so I've only gotten to know them really online. But my parents are older when they had me, and so I identify with a lot of the old-time radio guys that we were talking about, particularly, Mr. Raymond on Inner Sanctum Mysteries. That was my original horror host, and then I got into the Joe Bob Briggs of the world and everything, because Monster Vision was sort of a regular staple for me.
Yeah, I first saw Joe Bob when he was on the Movie Channel, and he was just recently, he had a book out, but he was John Bloom, right? He was a New York Times guy. And so him doing Joe Bob Briggs was like transgressive at the moment, and he seemed so fun but intelligent about that. He was a knowing nod to the movies. And I just saw him at the Mahoning Drive-In in Pennsylvania. He had done his How Rednecks Saved Hollywood, and he had a 4-day marathon of movies. And I got to watch them through his eyes. And Wax Museum, the 3D one. It was so good.
He wrote one of my favorite movie reviews ever, and it's for the film Blood Feast. He wrote in, most people think America lost its innocence on November 22nd, 1963, when JFK was assassinated. It actually happened 6 weeks earlier in a small theater in Bloomington, Illinois, when Blood Feast was shown for the first time.
Yeah.
And I think that's utterly brilliant, and it's a really good summation of a film that really did change filmmaking.
Gore. We didn't have the term really.
No, and I think it's interesting to note that that movie appears in the same year as the Grand Guignol wraps up in Paris.
And Hammer starts to rise up as well.
So with the rise of Hammer, the ability to add a little bit of sex and violence into the movies, the waning of the production code with the soon-to-be introduction of the rating system, you had these new types of movies that were coming out for the first time. You had that, you had the Coffin Joe movie
Yes.
coming out.
Great Brazilian politics right there. Yeah. That guy had guts.
Coffin Joe, another great horror host as well, who would be the regular on Brazilian television, would have regularly host things. He would do it in movies as well. There are a couple anthology films that are hosted by the Coffin Joe character.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. I knew of his films, his trilogy, which is amazing.
Oh man, yeah. No, there are about 9 movies in which Coffin Joe appears. At midnight, I'll
take your soul.
At this night, I'll possess your corpse. So the 2 originals.
And Embodiment of Evil
is the 3rd one. Although before Embodiment of Evil, the 3rd one was Awakening of the Beast.
Oh yeah. God.
Which everybody forgot about as soon as Embodiment of Evil.
I forgot about it.
There's also Hostile Flesh and Pleasure or something. I think.
I don't know.
It had a bunch of different. It's one of those movies that.
Multiple names.
Multiple names in different regions.
7 Doors of Death or The Beyond.
Oh my gosh! You want to talk about great titles? Just any Giallo movie. Any Giallo movie would have a great title. Your Vice is a locked room and only I have the key.
Yeah.
Kill the fatted calf and roast its flesh.
Don't torture a duckling.
Oh, don't torture a duckling. That's a great one. Yeah. No, there were some utterly. Spaghetti Westerns had some good ones.
Oh yeah.
Life is Tough. A Providence. I love that they put A in the title. Like Life is Tough. Wait for it. Right, Providence? Get it? Utterly forgettable spaghetti Western, but a great title.
So I want to give a few moments to the audience. Is there anything that you want to ask us weird folk up here specifically?
You were going over a horror host, and for me, I never really grew up with Elvira or Joe Bob, but when I did grow only cover horror, that was kind of what they were known for, and they would do it either in character or as themselves, and they would often cover like a lot of obscure ones, like the ones that even like previous ones usually never really covered as often. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on these newer ones like that?
Well, I've enjoyed the Cinema Snob.
Yeah.
At least some of the handful of video reviews that I've seen of his. Although there's the whole channel awesome controversy that we're not going to get into right now.
Yeah.
There's a whole long doc.
Yeah.
There's a whole long Google doc about all the things that went wrong with that. But Cinema Snob, really knew how to handle horror and put it into like a short form thing, because he would have 20-minute videos on what is it, the Caligula, that's what I'm thinking of. 2.5 hour movie, he would boil it down to about 20 minutes.
Right.
The best and the worst of that movie. Really just the worst, because there's not a whole lot of best with it.
Yeah.
Except for the production design.
The worst Tinto Brass movie ever.
Oh, which is saying something. I mean, I love me some Tinto Brass, but I mean,
Right. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that I really like about what's happening online. I mean, it ended in the 80s, late or early 90s, because infomercials and not streaming yet, but basically the death of where horror hosts were going, which was a place that we went to find these strange, exotic movies. But there's always a place, and now you have YouTube. There are plenty of places to go. Cinema Snob's one, but I can't remember the name of it, but there's multiple people who make top 10 lists of movies that have a specific theme that are always fun, and they're much more polished than they used to be. And they'll go down the opinion viewpoint as opposed to just saying these things. Why I disliked this dishonest ending of High Tension. Yeah. And things like that, I think, are invaluable. They're the voice of people who are passionate enough to be able to do that. And I think that it takes away the velvet rope of the critic. I think we need critics. I think it's important. But I think that the idea that there's only certain people who have the cachet to be able to speak to these things, I think is not correct. I think we need to have an amalgam of things. And I think the more voices that we have that, and let's put it this way, I'm a little bit of a Harlan Ellison guy here. You have to have an informed fucking opinion. Yes. Have something really to say. If you're just going to say things suck, you're not an opinion. It's just a noise. And so if you have the ability to do that, I look for the people who have passion, the people who are going to spend time online and they've taken the time to figure out the filmography of somebody, or they want to know why this was so important in that year. I think that's what's great. When I see people actually take the horror of the time and put it into context and see if it still has the context now, that's great stuff.
And people who do the research as well.
Yes.
Who a lot of times, unfortunately, it's stuck to people in academia, because archives are not always open to the public. But if you go to a university or somewhere that has a decent film archive, for instance, my PhD alma mater, Bowling Green State University, has the best pop culture library in the world. If you go to BGSU, you can get into that library and have access to a lot of these things, but not a lot of people know about this, and not a lot of people will realize, hey, what if I looked into the press books for some of these to see how these movies were sold to the public? Or what if I look at the novelization of the book, or things like that?
Yeah.
The things people wouldn't know to look for, and I think that's an ongoing problem. But I'm glad there are people out there who will do that research, and who will go into those archives and look at that.
And the home archivist is becoming something
100%.
Where you have people who, I have the first 10 issues of Famous Monsters, and I'm going to put them on issue, and people can take a look at it.
I have the original barf bag for Mark of the Devil.
Yeah.
People who have, I have some of those books we were talking about earlier, like the Mom and Dad, books.
Yeah.
That I had gotten from my friends over at Something Weird Video. Those people who will curate a personal archive, God bless them, because they're doing, real good work.
Yeah, and it keeps things from going down the level of diamonds and rust. It still has a tangible reality to it if it exists, and we can see that. And these folks that are like folk historians are actually helping the people who are putting that research together. And I think that that's an important thing, especially when we're talking about pop culture. Pop culture is such a strange, you want to talk about an amoeba. I mean, this is a thing that is constantly shifting and changing. But pop culture is no longer, there's not a fence between pop culture and culture. When you're starting to talk about 3-hour superhero movies that make $1 billion and people talk about it as if they're the Godfather trilogy, that culture barrier has disappeared. And I think some for the better, some for the worse. But I think we're going to really find ourselves in a spot where we can actually, pop culture has the ability to bring disparate groups together on the idea of passion.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Is there anything anybody else wants to say before we move on?
We got another comment.
So I did grow up with Joe Bob. Love him. Now I'm like it's almost like I'm going because I love the what are the 3000 the guys from Minnesota.
Mystery Science Theater?
Yes, I love
Yeah,
those guys.
those guys also helped keep a lot of these films alive.
Absolutely. And so I watched Svengoolie a lot. And then because I'm in Inner Sanctum, Mr. Raymond and his little counterpart Mary, I think.
Yes, Mary the Lipton
tea
tea.
lady.
Yes.
Because I want to produce, because I have my own production company, I want to start producing old radio plays, but just with a new, 21st century twist. And so I'm really getting into it, and then also bringing in radio back at that time was really white. And so I really want to start bringing in other cultures into radio programming. And I'm like really excited about it, very excited about it. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, and you're right. Really white and really male-driven as well.
Yes.
I mean, there was a reason. The only woman radio horror host was old Nancy on the
Right.
Circle, because that was the only role a woman could fit. Or as Mary the Lipton tea lady, a very domesticated type.
Unthreatening. Who was it? Was it Goulardi who had the wife? Who was it that had the wife that was always off? Zachary.
Yeah, but yes, Zachary had the wife, and she was in a box. And
Right.
Communicate to her in mumbles.
Yeah, that was as good as they could do.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned bringing up the idea of making new horror radio things.
Yes.
For one of my final projects in my PhD for a performance studies certificate I did a series of 6 old-time radio plays, but all adapted from classic ghost stories. And I wanted to make sure I had an equally, split up cast between men and women. And when I was adapting all these old ghost stories, I realized 90% of the speaking roles are men, and so I would have to rewrite the characters to be women, which, wasn't super complicated, but at the same time was complicated enough to have to rewrite most of these characters as women. It was just super problematic at the time. But yeah, these stories really need to continue, need to be told.
Yeah.
And I think there is some interest in that. When we have podcasts like Welcome to Night Vale,
Yes.
that are still going absolutely strong and have their fans. Mr. Creepypasta and everybody
Yes.
who tells these
Grassroots horror ideas.
Exactly. When you have these types of people, you can have these old horror folks come back, almost as if they've risen from the grave.
Oh. And there's a pretty good end right there. Until next time. Well, I want to thank Dr. Rhitt Bruart for being on today. Hellbent for Horror. Thank you, audience, for being here. We're going to have another show tomorrow, believe it or not, another podcast coming live from Sun Studios in Arizona. We are at Phoenix FearCON. If you are out and about, please come by and say hi to everybody. And until next time, stay hell-bent. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you very much.